my screen. There we go. See my screen. So good evening from the east coast of Australia. My name's Alan Hicks. I teach histology and histopathology here at the on the Gold Coast at Griffith University. I've got a 20-year background in medical science, living around the world, and I've just completed my PhD through the school, looking at registration of medical scientists in Australia, because you might be interested to know that there isn't any registration for biomedical scientists in Australia. So over here that work in pathology labs, situation in your countries, considering through Europe, anywhere in the UK, America, all the usual suspects, even in the Middle East where I was working last. So while I was doing my PhD, I was working with Dr. Eric Kilpatrick here, and Zoe was a colleague of mine. And I was trying to work out how to quantify the clinical impact. They said that medical scientists don't have enough patient contact and don't influence patient outcomes sufficiently to warrant licensing.
Hello, Alan. Could you open your audio device, please? And your presentation is also gone. I think maybe you have internet disruption, so your presentation is gone. So could you open your audio device and share your presentation again, please? And unmute your audio device, please.
How's that?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. You can proceed. You might have internet disruption, so your slide was gone.
Oh, okay. I do apologize. So yeah, clinical, in Australia, the medical scientists aren't registered as doctors and nurses and podiatrists and physios are. And one of the reasons for that is the government doesn't think that medical scientists influence patient outcomes enough. And it's often quoted that we only influence 70% of clinical decisions. This was based on a conference in Brazil in the mid-90s, where somebody did a quick analysis of the Mayo EMR, the electronic medical records for all of the Mayo Clinic, and found that about 70% of everybody who came through the Mayo Clinic had a pathology test done. Everybody ran with that, and it was legitimized by repetition. So now it's used by the Department of Health in the UK, in the NHS, and over here for the Royal College of Pathologists. In 2012, the internet, my internet is unstable for some reason. It's been working fine. Am I still here? In 2012, the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry decided that they should try and work out if we could actually base this number on some scientific evidence. And I was lucky enough to be working with Eric Kilpatrick at the time, who was on this task force. So we decided to look at clinical guidelines just to see if we could actually quantify how much impact pathology testing has on clinical outcomes. It was decided by the task force that we would use the cardiovascular disease clinical guidelines. Clinical guidelines direct doctors to what they should do. It doesn't mean that they actually have to follow it. but considering that cardiovascular disease is the world's #1 killer, this would seem to affect the largest population. And the latest statistics are that it's responsible for 31% of all global deaths. So, and around the world, there are a few other statistics. So I decided to take the clinical guidelines for the British Heart Foundation, the European guidelines, the American guidelines, and the ones that are in Australia and New Zealand, and do a comparison of all of their clinical guidelines related to clinical cardiovascular disease, just to see how many of them indicated that a doctor should actually run a pathology test. So I took the guidelines from the European Society of Cardiology, the American College of Cardiology, the Cardiac Society of Australia and New Zealand, and the Australian Heart Foundation, and then tallied them all up. After I looked at 101 clinical guidelines and run through them all to see if a pathology test was indicated, you can see here that there was 10, I broke them down into if it was a test required for initial diagnosis or as a follow-up, and then added that together. So we had 15 out of 20 from the UK, 24 of 32 in Europe, 25 of the 32 in America indicated a pathology test. And funnily enough, in Australia and New Zealand, 15 out of 16 clinical guidelines recommend that they do a pathology test. So if we look back at some of those results, if I've looked at 78% of those 101 guidelines produced by 5 different organizations indicate that a doctor should request a pathology test if they suspect cardiovascular disease. And while this number is not significantly different to the 70% published globally, this might be an underestimation in jurisdictions such as Australia, where laboratory investigations are indicated in almost all of CVD cases. This doesn't provide a direct link to improve patient outcomes, but does provide an index of the value of laboratory medicine, and which can complement other metrics. And using this objective methodology, it might be possible to determine the contribution of laboratory medicine to other less prevalent disease groups. And together, these data sets should provide a more accurate measure of the significance of laboratory medicine. And going back to my PhD, this actually gave me some concrete evidence that we do influence patient outcomes significantly more than is expected. The government here says that we don't influence enough patient outcomes and we don't have enough patient contact. I found studies that indicated that nurses spend 30% of their time with the patient. People in laboratories spend their whole day taking blood. If we don't influence clinical outcomes significantly, but we in Australia, they are especially with cardiovascular disease, we influence more than we are required to do testing on more than 90% of cardiovascular disease patients. Every cancer diagnosis goes through a goes through a laboratory, all transfusions. So this just provided some hard evidence to back up my PhD, which provides evidence for a review of the self-regulatory framework which currently exists in Australia.
So you have 2 minutes to conclude, please.
Thank you very much, conference coordinator. I've finished there. Any questions?
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for your timely completion of presentation. It's a very interesting topic, by the way. Clinical decision making is a very complicated process, not only in Australia and most of the other part of the world as well. So I would go to the audience first if they have any question for you. Please, audience, raise your hand. Yes, as
right. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really found it really inspired. But my question is that you stated that these guidelines are it's portrayed is more of an advisory basis, right? It is not. It's not a legal implementation that you have to do it. So my question to you is that even in the fact that if pathological testing is not in those guidelines, does it actually make a difference? Since either way, the guidelines itself is just an advice to the doctors. You don't essentially have to implement the same. Does it actually make a difference in that?
It's a good
I
point.
want to, I'm sorry to, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one another thing in the same question as well. Since this guideline is more specific to only cardiovascular diseases, or it's generalized term, because then your topic, which is like didn't properly mention, is a clinical decision making. Either it is only for cardiovasculars or is for other diseases as well. So please, your answer.
No, clinical guidelines are provided for every disease process, and they inform a doctor of what they are recommended to do. It's not legally binding, but if they don't actually follow those guidelines and it turns into a paralegal case, they can be found wanting in court because they haven't followed the guidelines. And I needed to find a way of trying to quantify, because as I say, people have this idea that we influence 70% of clinical outcomes. Now, there's no real way to nail that down. And my intention is to go through and add to this and make it a larger data set over the course of the rest of my academic career, and actually put it all together as a meta-analysis of guidelines across the world and actually see what the true number is. Because there's not really any way to quantify it. Every individual doctor has their own methods. They may over request or under request, but the intention was just to show that we have influence on patient outcomes. I mean, I'll ask this to everybody. Will your doctor prescribe you anything before he's seen the lab results? Generally not.
Generally not, correct. That's true.
So I needed to get some hard evidence to pressure the government into actually recognizing medical scientists as medical professionals in this country. My experience overseas and my own personal experience is that registration should be done because there is a lot of errors, and in particular, the only definitive way of finding out whether your what your COVID status is by testing somebody. And in Australia, the workforce that are conducting this are not registered. So how do we know if they're actually doing it properly?
Thank you very much once again, Alan. Thanks a lot for your very interesting.